So bad. Chapter Part 2, Chapter 6. Well, anything to make delay. The king's council advised him against arriving at a decision in our matter too precipitate, not precipitously, it's precipitately. He arrived at a decision too precipitately, so they sent a committee of priests, always priests, into Lorraine to inquire into Joan's character and history, a matter which would consume several weeks, of course. You see how fastidious they were? It was as if people should come to put out the fire when a man's house was burning down, and they waited till they could send into another country to find out if he'd always kept the Sabbath or not before letting him try. So the days poked along, dreary for us young people in some ways, but not in all, for we had one great anticipation in front of us. We had never seen a king, and now some day we should have a prodigious spectacle to see and to treasure in our memories all our lives. So we were on the lookout, and always eager and watching for the chance. The others were doomed to wait longer than I, as it turned out. One day great news came. The Orleans commissioners, with Yolande and our knights, had at last the council's position and persuaded the king to see Joan. Joan received the immense news gratefully, but without losing her head. But with us others, it was otherwise. We could not eat or sleep or do any rational thing for the excitement and the glory of it. During 2 days, our pair of noble knights were in distress and trepidation on Joan's account, for the audience was to be at night, and they were afraid that Joan would be so paralyzed by the glare of light from the long files of torches, the solemn pomps and ceremonies, the great concourses of renowned personages, the brilliant costumes, and the other splendors of the court, that she, a simple country maid, and all unused to such things, would be overcome by these terrors and make a piteous fail. No doubt I have No doubt I could have comforted them, but I was not free to speak. Would Joan be disturbed by the cheap spectacle, this tinsel show with its small king and his butterfly doublets? She who had spoken face to face with the princes of heaven, the familiars of God, and seen the retinue of angels stretching back into the remoteness of the sky, myriads upon myriads, like a measureless fan of light, a glory like the glory of the sun streaming from each of these innumerable heads, the massed radiance filling the deeps of space with a blinding splendor? I thought not. Queen Yolande wanted Joan to make the best possible impression upon the king and the court. So she was strenuous to have her clothed in the richest stuff, wrought upon the princeliest pattern. So she was strenuous to have her clothed in the richest stuff, wrought upon the princeliest pattern, and set off with jewels. But in that she had to be disappointed, of course, Joan not being persuadable to do it, but begging to be simply and sincerely dressed as become a servant of God, and one sent upon a mission of a serious sort and great political import. So then the gracious queen imagined and contrived that simple and witching costume which I have described to you so many times, and which I cannot think of even now in my dull age, without being moved, just as rhythmical and exquisite music moves on. For that was music, that dress. That is what it was. Music that one saw with the eyes and felt in the heart. Yes, she was a poem. She was a dream. She was a spirit which was clothed in that. She kept the raiment always and wore it several times upon occasions of state, and it is preserved to this day in the treasury of Orleans, with 2 of her swords and her banner and other things now sacred because they belonged to her. At the appointed time, the Count of Vendôme, a great lord of the court, came richly clothed with his train of servants and assistants to conduct Joan to the king, and the 2 knights and I went with her, being entitled to this privilege by reason of our official positions near her person. When we entered the great audience hall, there it all was, just as I have already painted it. Here were ranks of guards in shining armor and with polished halberds. 2 sides of the hall were like flower gardens for a variety of color and the magnificence of the costumes. Light streamed upon these masses of color from 250 flambeaux. There was a wide, free space down the hall down the middle of the hall, and at the end of it was a throne royally canopied, and upon it sat a crown and scepter, figured nobly clothed and blazing with jewels. It is true that Joan had been hindered and put off a good while, but now that she was admitted to an audience at last, she was received with honors granted to only the greatest personages. At the entrance door stood four heralds in a row in splendid tabards, with long, slender silver trumpets at their mouths, with square silken banners depending from them embroidered with the arms of France. As Joan and the Count passed by, these trumpets gave forth in unison one long, rich note, and as we moved down the hall under the pictured and gilded vaulting, this was repeated at every 50 feet of our progress, 6 times in all. It made our good knights proud and happy, and they held themselves erect and stiff in their stride and looked fine and soldierly. They were not expecting this beautiful and honorable tribute to our little country maid. Joan walked 2 yards behind the Count. We three walked 2 yards behind Joan. Our solemn march ended when we were as yet some 8 or 10 steps from the throne. The Count made a deep obeisance, pronounced Joan's name, then bowed again and moved to his place among a group of officials near the throne. I was devouring the crowned personage with all my eyes, and my heart almost stood still with awe. The eyes of all others were fixed upon Joan in a gaze of wonder which was half worship and which seemed to say, "How sweet, how lovely, how divine." All lips were parted and motionless, which was a sure sign that these people who seldom forget themselves had forgotten themselves now, and were not conscious of anything but the one object they were gazing upon. They had the look of people who are under the enchantment of a vision. Then they presently began to come to life again, rousing themselves out of the spell and shaking it off as one drives away little by little a clinging drowsiness or intoxication. Now they fixed their attention upon Joan with a strong new interest of another sort. They were full of curiosity to see what she would do, they having a secret and particular reason for this curiosity. So they watched. This is what they saw. She made no obeisance, not even any slight inclination of her head, but stood looking toward the throne in silence. That was all there was to see at present. I glanced up at Demetz and was shocked at the paleness of his face. I whispered and said, "What is it, man? What is it?" His answering whisper was so weak I could hardly catch it. "They have taken advantage of the hint in her letter to play a trick upon her. She will err and they will laugh at her. This is not the king that sits there." Then I glanced at Joan. She was still gazing steadfastly toward the throne, and I had the curious fancy that even her shoulders and the back of her head expressed bewilderment. Now she turned her head slowly, and her eye wandered along the lines of standing courtiers till it fell upon a young man who was very quietly dressed. Then her face lighted joyously, and she ran and threw herself at his feet and clasped his knees, exclaiming in a soft, melodious voice, which was her birthright, and was now charged with deep and tender feeling, "God of grace, give you long life, O dear and gentle Dauphin." In his astonishment and exultation, Demetz cried out, "By the shadow of God, it is an amazing thing." Then he mashed all the bones of my hand in his grateful grip and added with a proud shake of his mane, "Now, what have these painted infidels to say?" Meantime, the young person in the plain clothes was saying to Joan, "Ah, you mistake, my child. I'm not the king. There he is." And he pointed to the throne. The knight's face clouded and he muttered in grief and indignation, "Ah, it is a shame to use her so, but for this lie she had gone through safe. I will go and proclaim to all the house what—" "Stay where you are," whispered I in the subaltern in a breath, and made him stop in his place. Joan did not stir from her knees, but still lifted her happy face toward the king and said, "No, gracious liege, you are he, and none other." Demetz's trouble vanished away, and he said, "Verily, she was not guessing, she knew. Now, how could she know? It is a miracle. I am content, and will meddle no more, for I perceive that she is equal to her occasions, having that in her head that cannot profitably be helped by the vacancy that is in mine."